Hello everyone, welcome to the bottom line on City Watch LA. I am Mihran Kalaydjian. Today we are joined by City Controller candidate Zach Sokoloff to discuss the future of Los Angeles finances, accountability, and whether City Hall can truly live within its means. Let's get to the bottom line. Zach, welcome to the show.
Hello, Miran. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My question: is City Hall being honest with Angelinos about the true financial condition of Los Angeles?
Look, I think what City Hall is being honest about through its words as much as its deeds is that it's unable to manage the financial situation here in Los Angeles, Miran. We have a staggering budget deficit. We have costs that are out of control and unaccounted for. We have a revenue problem in the city, and it's clear that the current leadership in the city has been unable to make a difference in delivering results for the people of Los Angeles.
Is this fundamentally a spending problem or a failure of a leadership and accountability?
Yeah, well, look, let me back up for a sec, Miran, because I think it's helpful to define the role of controller as I see it. And that really informs my candidacy and what I hope to accomplish if I'm fortunate enough to be elected. And so the role of controller, as most folks know, and as this publication is very aptly named, is the financial watchdog of the city of Los Angeles, the chief auditor. And in my view, that really entails three major responsibilities. The first is determining whether tax dollars are being spent as intended. The second is whether the policy outcomes are being produced that taxpayers were promised. And then the third and most critical function is when either of those first two questions is no, the city controller must propose solutions and work collaboratively to deliver results. And I think that this last point is worth focusing on for a second, Miran, because the controller's position is neither executive nor legislative. To effectuate change, the controller must work in partnership to solve problems. And my fundamental view and animating thesis in this campaign is that Angelinos are tired of reports. They want to see results. Angelinos don't need more information. They want to see impact. And so, in my view, you ask whether this is a revenue problem or an expense problem. And in my perspective, Miran, the answer is both. I don't think that you can close the budget gap that we have through cost cutting alone. I think you need to look at new and creative sources of revenue for the city of Los Angeles. That does not mean imposing more new taxes on Angelinos. I think folks are feeling the affordability crisis in almost every respect of their life, but we need to find new and creative ways of generating revenue in Los Angeles. And so one of the examples that I talk about in our campaign, one of the priorities of my office, would be hiring and appointing someone to the role of Chief Revenue Officer in Los Angeles, a position specifically designed to understand how we can promote new and creative revenue streams for Los Angeles. And I think a lot of that I draw from my own personal background. I come from the world of entertainment and production, Miran. I managed two multi-billion-dollar economic development projects in the entertainment industry, and I saw firsthand how the city and the state abandoned the entertainment industry and acted too slowly and insufficiently to keep production here in LA. And what we've seen as a result is production fleeing the state, chasing tax credits in low-cost geographies. And who bear the brunt of that are not the actors and the directors that we see at the Golden Globes and the Academy Awards. The people who bear the brunt of that, Miran, are the hardworking men and women below the line, the lighting, grip, gaffing crew members, the folks who are members of unions who make family supporting wages, whose names appear on the credit long after we all leave the movie theater. These folks have been out of work for 1, 2, 3 years, and they face very bleak prospects for how to continue to stay employed in a consistent basis, doing the job that they've done for decades in some cases here in Los Angeles. And so what that means is our tax base is eroded because folks are bringing in less income. When folks have less income, they shop at their local restaurants less, they go to the movie theaters less, they are not putting as much money back into their community. And the city leadership and the controller has, in my view, completely abdicated their responsibility to highlight the impact of overlooking this policy. And so, in my view, there is enormous opportunity to generate new revenue streams for the city of Los Angeles, but there also is a cost problem. We have $1 billion budget deficit. It's not going to be closed through cost cutting alone, Moran. There are too many vulnerable communities who depend on the services that we provide, but there are obvious opportunities and areas for improvement where there are waste, where there has been misspending, where there is a lack of accountability and oversight. And that is a huge priority of mine as I run this race. And if I'm fortunate enough to be elected, my offices would focus on this from day one.
So, misleading is a very huge problem in our city. So, is the city misleading the public by presenting financial projections that ignore known costs like employee raises?
Look, I think if there are examples where we have known cost escalations and those are not being factored into the budget, Miran, I would say that that is misleading. That's not something that we would typically do in any sort of business environment. Again, I come from a role in the business world where, I had to manage multi-billion dollar budgets, large complex teams where we built coalitions to accomplish really big, complex goals. And when you know that there are costs coming down the pipe and you don't highlight those or you don't bake those into your financial projections, I would call that misleading. And I think that Angelenos deserve better. Clear-eyed financial judgment is a critical skill given the challenges that we face as a city. And so it's not just about making sure that Angelenos are aware, but also once we are aware, Miran, what do we do about it? Because again, I think the role of controller is an interesting one where it is in part a watchdog, but I think that the role has been dramatically underutilized. And I think that that means the individual in that role has done an ineffective job at leveraging the authority of the office. And in my view, I would go in and I would take an approach that is much more proactive, that is much more balancing accountability and collaboration. I think when you focused exclusively on accountability, you are only doing part one of the job. The job starts, Miran, once you've identified issues within the city. Then you need to work collaboratively to solve those problems and deliver results. And beyond that, in my view, accountability does not need to be antagonistic, nor does collaboration need to be acquiescent. I think we all have been in a situation, I'll just speak personally here, Miran, like if I want to have a cookie after dinner and my wife shoots me a look and she says, Zach, do you need that cookie? That is accountability in its truest form. And that doesn't always feel good. But I think part of that is how you do the job, how you deliver that accountability. And I think rethinking the ways that the controller works with other departments within the city is critical to ensuring not only that the right information is identified, but that information is then translated into impact that Angelenos feel on an everyday basis.
Our budget has been a disaster. Would a 2-year budget improve accountability or give politicians more room to hide problems? Do you support that shift?
Look, I think long-term planning is critical in any organization. I think if you don't know where you're going, Miran, you're likely to get lost along the way. If you don't know what is coming around the corner, you may make short-term decisions that feel good in the moment, but are putting your organization at a disadvantage over the long term. And Los Angeles city government is a large, complex organization that needs to be managed effectively. And I don't think we've had that level of effective management in the city in a lot of different respects. And so I do support a longer term view on budgeting, not only on the budget itself, but capital expenditures. I think we need to understand where we're anticipating to spend money on large capital projects going forward. I think this is especially critical in light of the next 2 years that we have ahead of us with the World Cup, the Super Bowl, and ultimately culminating with the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And so I do think that having the longer term view is important. But at the end of the day, Moran, if you have the same people in office, how can you expect things to change? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so you can change the time frame on which we're budgeting, but if you don't change the people involved, the outcomes are going to be the same.
So I'm going to go to the labor agreements, which has been disaster. Why should taxpayers trust labor agreements negotiated behind closed doors that commit billions in future obligations?
Look, I'll say this, Miran. We live in a representative democracy, and we elect individuals. We entrust them to make decisions on our behalf. That also includes the ability to appoint individuals, whether it's the CAO or otherwise. We have elections every 4 years to hold people accountable if we don't think that they've done a good job or we don't think that they've lived up to the trust that we placed in them. You can vote them out. That's the beauty of our democracy. And so, on some level, I do believe that we should trust the negotiated agreements between the city and the labor unions, even if they happen, you know, not entirely in full view of the public. I think that the public should absolutely be made aware of what's included in those agreements and that we need to understand what obligations we're committing ourselves to as a city. But at the end of the day, we don't live in a direct democracy. We live in a representative democracy. And I think that it's okay that we entrust our elected leaders to make decisions on our behalf. That said, I think we do need to focus on two specific dueling priorities here, Miran. One is making sure, again, that Angelenos are aware of the decisions that their elected leaders are making. But we also have to make sure, and this is again, I go back to a point that I raised earlier, it is exorbitantly expensive to live in Los Angeles, Miran. And I particularly think of the civil servants who serve our city, who get up every morning and go to work trying to make their community a better place. These are individuals who are dedicating their life to the service of others, and I believe that that ought to be celebrated. That doesn't mean that everybody is perfect, but I think that by and large, these are folks who have very good intentions. And when those individuals can't live in Los Angeles, when our firefighters and our cops and our teachers and our service workers can't live in the city that they serve, that to me is a problem. I think that that breaks the bonds of connection between the people that are being served and the people that are serving them. And so I do believe that we have to make sure that folks can afford to live in LA. We cannot price people out of living in Los Angeles. And in my view, that means paying fair wages so that people can rent an apartment, can ultimately maybe buy a home, can send their kids to public school here. And so in my view, it is on the one hand, on the other hand, where the transparency and information is important. But again, my focus is laser trained on results. We need to make it more affordable to live in the city. We need to make sure that folks up and down the economy can afford to live in Los Angeles, that they're getting paid a fair wage. And if this is a value that we have, Moran, we have to bake that into the budget process. We have to make sure that it is honestly accounted for, that all cost escalations are transparently included, and that we also hold ourselves to accountable to make sure that the revenue side of the equation is keeping up with those costs that we're saying represent the values that we have as a city.
I'm going to have a follow-up question. Should
Sure.
the city be allowed to approve labor contracts that knowingly create current or future deficits?
Ooh, Miran, that's a hard-hitting question, man. Look, I think that the answer is yes. I think that they should be allowed to approve those types of agreements. I think that it is, would I say it's prudent for the city to do that? I'm not sure I would say it's prudent for the city to do that. But again, I do think we entrust the city to make decisions for the best interest of the people of Los Angeles. And in my view, that includes making deals with labor unions that treat people fairly and that pay fair wages. Again, I don't know if I would recommend as a leader of the city knowingly engaging in agreements that put us in deficits. I think that that is going down a very slippery slope and puts a lot of pressure on the city to compensate or to balance that cost incurrence with revenue that we bring in. And so if the city is going to continue to sign labor agreements in that respect, I think it is even more important that we focus on the revenue side of the equation, because you cannot be continuing to increase our costs and not at the same time prioritizing enormous focus on increasing revenue in the city. I mean, we have tourism, which is down, Miran. We have industries that are divesting from Los Angeles. I mentioned production and entertainment. That is, I think, a very clear example, but it's not the only one. You have other industries that have made the decision that it is too difficult to do business in Los Angeles. And I think our housing crisis, which I think is directly correlated, the lack of affordable housing is directly correlated to the lack of supply in housing, is 100% affected by the fact that we make it incredibly challenging to build here in Los Angeles. Red tape, permitting is just onerous. The additional requirements that we place on folks is very difficult. And there are clear examples, data-driven examples, Miran, of other municipalities who incentivize the construction of housing and who see rents going down. I'll give you one example. In 2025, the city of Austin, Texas, built 25,000 new housing units within its city limits. In that same year, 2025, Los Angeles built about 13,000 apartment units in our city. So half the number of apartments built in LA as Austin. Austin, for whatever it's worth as a city, is 1/7 the size of Los Angeles. And so when you prorate that on an apples to apples basis, Austin is building 14 times more apartment units per capita than we are as a city. And lo and behold, Miran, rents in Austin have gone down and rents in Los Angeles have gone up. And so when you ignore economic data, when you have a leadership infrastructure that is beholden to ideology more than results, that's what you get. And I think that Angelenos deserve better.
Has the city been misusing its reserve fund to cover up budget problems?
Again, this is part of what I am very excited to dig into, if I'm elected, Miran. But I would say, in my view, the reserve fund should only be drawn in extraordinary circumstances. I mean, I think about this as a savings account like you would have on a personal, household budget. These are dollars that need to be guarded very preciously and should only be drawn in extraordinary emergent circumstances. And so, yes, if we're in a process where we're using the reserve fund to balance a budget because the city has done a poor job, because its leaders have allowed budgeting, irresponsible budgeting to happen, I would say that that is a poor use of our reserve funds.
You mentioned this many times. Do you support creating an independent office with real authority to monitor city spending in real time?
Absolutely. And the beauty of the answer to that question is, Miran, I think that it already exists, which is the controller's office. My very strong view is that there is a lot more authority embedded within the controller office than the current occupant is utilizing. I think that the incumbent spends a lot more time complaining about what he can't do than focusing on what he can do. And I would be focused on the full limits of the controller authorities as vested under the charter of the city of Los Angeles. And I think part of that is also when you have an office whose budget is set by the mayor and the city council, I would say it's bad business for the people of LA, for that individual to go around pissing off the mayor and the city council. When you have someone who controls your budget and you antagonize them, oftentimes for the sake of antagonizing them, that to me is an abdication of your responsibility as an elected official and a public servant. I think when you take the oath of office, Mihran, that is a sacred oath. You are committing yourself to find common ground with other people. You are committing yourself to work together with people who may sometimes disagree with you. And while we all have our personal ideologies, I think that there is a large degree of doing your job on behalf of the people of Los Angeles. And so I go back to the approach that I would take as controller, which I think is in stark contrast to the incumbent's approach, which has been much more combative, much more blaming and finger pointing, much less focused on collaborating, much less focused on solving problems. And when you balance accountability and collaboration, I think you would be surprised at how excited people are to want to work with you. I'm a big believer, Mihran, in the saying that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And that is exactly how I would approach this role. And look, I listened to your interview with the incumbent, and I think it's ironic that in an election year, he starts talking about, well, people are now actually starting to want to work with us after he's heard our campaign talk about how that hasn't been the case for the first 3.5 years of his term. And so again, when people show you who they are, Mihran, believe them the first time. We've seen how the incumbent comports himself in office. And if Angelenos think that they're better off today than they were 4 years ago, I'm probably not the candidate for you. But if you think that the city is on a bad track, if you think that we need to do things differently, that we need to make a change, because I'll remind you, Mihran, nothing changes if nothing changes. And if you want change, vote for Zach Sokoloff.
If elected, will you publicly call out the mayor or city council by name if taxpayer funds are being mismanaged?
Look, I think my responsibility, if elected, is to advocate on behalf of the people of Los Angeles. Every tool in my tool belt needs to be at my disposal to do that effectively. But I will say, if I'm calling out the mayor or the city council by name as the first step, I think that that's falling into the same trap that the current incumbent has gotten himself into. I think that having conversations with people as people, my first action as city controller, Mihran, I would go to every elected official, including the mayor and city council. I would go to every general manager of every department, and I would ask them one very simple question. I would say, how can I help you do your job better? And then I would close my mouth and I would listen. Because I think when you call people out for the sake of calling people out, when you are grandstanding and trying to grab headlines instead of trying to get stuff done, that we find ourselves in the position that we're in right now, which is Angelenos feel like they're paying more and getting less, and that their government doesn't work for them. And so, absolutely, I reserve the right to call people out by name and publicly, but I view that as a step later on down the line if more collaborative problem-solving discussions have broken down.
So, homelessness is a major disaster in the city of Los Angeles. Do the billions spent on homelessness with limited visible results reflect a failure of oversight?
Absolutely. I don't know how you could look at the homelessness crisis and not say that this is in part due to a failure of oversight. And look, I think it's important to say from the beginning, Mihran, that homelessness is a humanitarian crisis. These are our neighbors. These are people who had dreams and aspirations, whose life has been derailed. And, we spent a lot of time on the campaign, Mihran, focused on homelessness. I'd encourage people to go to our Instagram accounts, to look up the content that we've produced around homelessness. We've not only focused on encampments all around the city and how we think things could be doing better, but we've talked to unhoused individuals. We've talked to former addicts, and putting a face to this crisis changes it, in my opinion, because this is not just a statistic or a number. These are people's lives, and it's undignified to let people live on the street. It is not compassionate to let people live on the street. And clearly, we have not made nearly enough progress in solving this issue. And I would say our campaign takes a very different approach to homelessness than the current leadership in the city promote. We have applied what I would call a fairly rigid housing first approach to homelessness in Los Angeles. The incumbent in particular seems to believe blindly in the idea that if you simply put someone in housing, the problem is solved. I could not disagree more with that sentiment. Very similarly to what I said earlier, putting someone under shelter is just the beginning of the assistance and treatment that that individual needs to get their life back on track. And so what we would do is expand our approach to homelessness and apply or recommend applying what we would call a recovery first approach to homelessness. This, in some instances, would require drug addiction treatment as a condition of residency in our permanent supportive housing or transitional housing. Again, I was just on Skid Row the other day with an addict, a former addict who's now started his own recovery services initiative called Time to Go, a guy named Brendan Clark. He's an inspiration. And he was very honest. And he said, every single time I left a treatment facility after 30 days, I relapsed. And so we need to reconsider how we are treating the most vulnerable among us. And if you simply put them under shelter, if you allow them to exist in the same environment where all of the temptation is still around them, they're going to relapse. Addiction is a disease. You need to work intensively, one-on-one with people to help set them on a path to leading a healthy, self-directed life. And so we've seen, in my opinion, Mihran, a failure to improve our homelessness system because we have a wrong-headed approach to how we solve homelessness. And let me connect it even further to the job of controller, which is when you spend billions on a misguided approach to our biggest crisis, you deplete the budget of much needed funds for other critical services. And so when Angelenos drive around the city and they get their tires wrecked because of potholes, or when a family is walking their child in a stroller down the sidewalk and there are these enormous cracks in the sidewalk, or a small business owner has streetlights that have been out for 6, 12, 18 months, the reason that that happens is because when we spend money poorly in one area, it deprives the budget in other areas. And so I think that there is a very clear connection between the policies supported by the incumbent and the misguided approach to homelessness, and why we have less money available for other much needed services that are eroding and undermining the quality of life of Angelenos across the city.
City liability payouts continue to rise. Who is being held accountable?
Look, that's a great question, Mihran. I don't think anyone is being held accountable. I think that that's the issue. I think that we see liability payouts growing. I think that departments are not forced to reckon with the liability payouts that we have. Look, candidly, Mihran, I would like to see I would like to see the city maybe consider taking one of these cases to court. I think that we are very quick to settle, and that has ballooned the liability payouts. It's paid out of the general fund. It's not allocated to specific departments. Um, but I think clearly ignoring this issue or budgeting improperly for it is a mistake by city council and by the mayor and by city hall more broadly. And so we've now had data for several years in recent times about where liability payments are and where they're going. And again, I would just ask the question, what has changed? I think identifying problems is important. Transparency is a critical function of this job, but it is just the beginning. Angelenos do not simply want transparency. They want to see their leaders doing something with the information brought to light. And I don't think that our current leadership has done an effective job in that regard.
How will you remain politically independent in a system driven by alliances and pressure?
Look, I think this is the art as much as the science of the role of controller. And I think it's incredibly important that Angelenos consider the right mix of skills that they want in their controller to navigate that balance because independence is critical. I'm a political outsider, Miran. I am beholden to no one. I am coming in with no indebtedness to anyone in the system. But at the same time, I also know that no one person can do this alone. That alliances are not a bad word when leveraged on behalf of the people of Los Angeles. And so I do not shirk from the need to build relationships, to understand city stakeholders, fellow elected officials as people, what motivated them to run for office in the first place? What do they care about? How can I help them do their job better? Again, I go back to this point, which is maybe unconventional to hear from a political candidate, Miran, but I was raised to believe that it's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit. The incumbent is very fond of taking credit, oftentimes for things that he did not do, Miran. That is going to be very different under a Zach Sokoloff controllership if I'm fortunate enough to be elected. I am not doing this to grab headlines. I am not doing this to put my name in the spotlight. I am very content to be in the background and to be operating in a manner that judges success, not by how many clicks I get, but by what impact I have on Angelenos. And so again, this is just a fundamentally different perspective that I have to the incumbent. It's a humility that I bring to this role that I think is sorely needed in city government. And so that is how I would navigate that very delicate balance between remaining independent, but also realizing that our problems are so big that we need to work together to solve them.
And my last question is, what is one truth about the city's finances that politicians know but won't say publicly?
One truth, Miran. I heard that question very clearly. We could probably have a whole other podcast just on this question. But I would go back to the point that I raised about homelessness, which is we have an approach that I think has led us down a bad path. I think that and some of this, I will say, we have to look to Sacramento, Miran. There's a code section called 8255 that prohibits state funds from being used to build housing for homeless individuals that requires drug treatment as a condition of residency. That is a state law that is on the books. We can't change that as a city, though I do think examining how the controller can work collaboratively across levels of government, not just within levels of government. So I would be eager to build relationships with my state peers, state level elected peers, with even the federal level elected peers, But 8255 is the law of the land. And so, what does that mean for us? I think that that means that Los Angeles needs to be using its taxpayer dollars to fund approaches that are proven to work. And so, when you have an administration, when you have an incumbent controller who is so invested, so ideologically committed to a specific approach, you ignore the results of adhering to that approach because you're blinded by your principles. And so my view is that when you continue to do the same thing around homelessness, you ignore changes that could be made to improve outcomes for Angelenos. I'm a big believer, Miran, in President Franklin Roosevelt's approach to government, which states bold, persistent experimentation. You need to try something, see if it works, be clear-eyed enough to admit that it is or it isn't. And if it isn't, that's okay. You can change course, choose a different direction, and make a different decision about how to solve a problem. And so again, I go back to this truth is housing first is a start, but not an end to how we solve our homelessness crisis. It is an incomplete solution to a very complicated problem. And in my view, the only way we are going to show true compassion to our unhoused neighbors to get the 40 plus thousand individuals off the street and onto a path to recovery, onto a path to a healthy, self-directed life, is you need to provide alternatives to drug-tolerant housing. You need to provide recovery housing that allows people to be in an environment that sets them up for success.
Zach, thank you for joining us and for your time today. This race is about more than numbers. It's about trust, accountability, and whether Los Angeles can finally live within its means. I'm Mihran Kalaydjian, and this is the bottom line on City Watch LA. Thank you.
Thank you, Miran.